Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a share of screen like we've been doing. And that is going to be...
Just to let you know, Mendy, I have to get off at 10:15.
Okay, you are forgiven in advance.
Thank you. I'll miss the last 15 minutes, but
you missed the question part. We're going to miss you for that. All right. So the Torah portion we read yesterday, and I sent this piece out to everyone before, is actually, I thought I had it, something. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong one. Let me stop this. Had one a little bit larger. Maybe not. Sorry. Okay, that's going to be a little easier to read. Okay, so the Torah portion has a central. Every part of the Torah is holy and important to us. There are some parts of the Torah which are, just as far as our unfolding, a little bit more perhaps central or even more directly relevant to us than others. Yesterday we read the portion of the giving of the Torah. Giving of the Torah is when we got the Torah, when we became a people. That was the transition from Hebrews into the Jewish people. It was definitely, in the scope of our history, one of the more central and profoundly impactful episodes that we've gone through, that we've had. And the giving of the Torah, 3,300, and I think it's 3,333 years ago, yes, that is an event. But in reading about it, again, this is also refers to most of the Torah, to the entire Torah in a way, but specifically with the Torah, we don't see that just as an event that happened. It's an event that happens in the blessings we say every morning. We thank God for giving us the Torah, and we say the language, no sein ha-Torah, no tein ha-Torah, and in the Hebrew, that is in the present tense. In other words, not God gave it to us, God gives it to us. And what that means is, and according to our spiritual masters have taught us, that when we study Torah, even we're in the right frame of mind, we have a capacity to re-experience the illumination, the mental clarity, the spiritual clarity of Sinai. And it's an ongoing opportunity for us. So looking at what happened at Sinai, because if you imagine there's a few million people standing on a mountain and they have a revelation, which is really a once in the history of the revelation, the idea of the spiritual, psycho-spiritual clarity that they had, that if you look and see that's what they got, that's what those people experienced, and we start looking and say, what is it that we can experience now? Because it's something that as I say, it's an ongoing process. So looking at that, first piece I put here, number one, is a verse from the Torah. It's what we could call the first verse of the Ten Commandments. It's when God says, God spoke all these words, which means all the words, in other words, the following 10 commandments. And then there's a word that occurs quite a bit in Torah that ends up here. And in Hebrew, it's lemor. And when I was a kid, going to yeshiva, going to a Jewish day school out here in New Jersey, there was many times in the Torah, it'll say, God said to Moses, lemor, saying. And I used to think it was just an extra word. If God said to Moses, of course he's saying. What do you need? What is a saying for? Then as I got older, I saw that the interpretation is that when God spoke to Moses, and then he would say, God spoke to Moses not as a personal, private communication, but lemor, to say to others. It was with a mission to convey these words to others, which makes sense. Now, that makes sense in the verses about when God's talking to Moses about giving a message to the other people, to the Jewish people, to the world. Here, God spoke to the Jewish people. Everybody, all Jews alive at the time, were there by the mountain. Our rabbis tell us that the souls of all future generations were there, there's a tradition. I think there's a Jewish singles website called either Saw You at Sinai or Met You at Sinai, because of this tradition. So we were all at Sinai, even though it was 30,000 years ago. There's our souls at some level, even though we don't remember that. But if the idea is, if God is speaking to everybody, so what's Lamor to say? To say to whom? So in number 2, we have the Medrash, the Chilta, and it brings a debate between 2 great rabbis from the 2nd century. Rabbi Shmuel says that this teaches that they responded to the positive commandments, yes, and to the negative commandments, no. So God says, believe in God. They go, yeah. Don't serve other gods, no. And they're going through the 10 commandments, the ones where we're bidden to do something, everybody says, yes, we're with you. And the things where we're told not to do it, they say, no, we won't. Rabbi Akiva says they responded yes to the positive commandments and yes to the negative commandments. So God says, believe in God, yes. And he says, don't believe in other gods, no, yes. In other words, yes, we will do what you say and not believe in other gods, which is a little bit roundabout. Now, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, just to get a little bit of a whisper of who they are, and we're going to unpack that a little bit more going forward because it's going to be relevant, very relevant to today's conversation. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva are 2 rabbis, just to give you some general biographical data to see about this conversation these 2 people are having. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva are 2 of the greats of our history. They lived in the 2nd century. They are from the founders of the Talmud, so to speak. They are from the early generations of Talmudic teachers, great teachers of our people, living in very difficult times under Roman rule, 1st and 2nd century. Towards the end of the 1st century is when the temple is destroyed. Into the 2nd century, horrible, horrible persecution from the Romans. Some of you may remember, or all of you may remember, that there's a piece in the Yom Kippur service, Musaf service. The Musaf service is right after Yizkor, which is when the congregation tends to become a lot smaller. Right after Yizkor, there's a lot more seats. And so that part, less people are there for, but there's a piece there that is very poetic, and there is about the 10 martyred rabbis cruelly tortured and killed by the Romans, they say it was Hadrian. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva are 2 of those 10. Rabbi Shmuel is described there as Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. He was not only a Kohen, but the high priest. And they're in the liturgy that we have in Yom Kippur, and this is, I think, universal. It doesn't go from Sephardic, Ashkenazic, and so on. We all have the same liturgy of this poetry that he was able to ask God, to connect with God. So what's going on here? Is this what our destiny is? And he was told that it is, and he surrendered himself to he had no choice really, but the Roman torture and death. And Rabbi Akiva also met his death there. So now they're having this conversation and say, what was the response? When it says in the Torah that God spoke all these words, Lamor, to say, well, it means that God said these words with the intention that there's going to be a response from the people. This was not supposed to just be a spectator sport. The Jews were intended to respond. And then they have a debate. How do they respond? Everybody says that on the positive commandments, they said yes. But then there's a debate. What did they answer to the negatives? It's on the face of it, it's not, historical data is always important, but you gotta wonder a little bit about the depth of the argument on its face. Then the Mechilta, that Medrash, takes another piece. And that same piece takes another piece of the Sinai experience, and also something a little bit more profoundly, are a little unsettling, something that a little more curious. It says that the people, the Torah says, it's in yesterday's Torah portion. This is verse 1 in chapter 20. This is chapter verse 15. It's on 14 verses later. It says that at this incredible experience at Sinai, when there's this spiritual fireworks, and the Jews are overwhelmed by not only by the fact that they're experiencing God palpably, right? Because we can believe in God, but they experience God in a very palpable way, an unmistakable way. There were also, it says there were sounds, and there's call of a shofar, and then there was a lot of more attendant theatrics going on. It says people saw the voices. It says they saw the voices, and I should have taken the next two words of the verse. So saw the verses and the voices and the flames. So I'm sorry. All the point. I'm sorry, I did do it. Number 3, it says people saw the voices and the torches. Okay, you can say that, and the sound of the shofar and the smoking mountain. Okay, now obviously people can see torches. They can see a smoking mountain. You're not going to see voices, and you're not going to see the sound of the shofar. You hear those, you don't see them. So the Medrash goes back to that. It says, what does that mean? The people saw the voices. So Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva have a debate about this too. Rabbi Yishmael says they saw what is normally seen and heard what is normally heard. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says, cool. Torah is saying that everybody, all the people, it's a few million people, but everybody experienced everything. They experienced everything. The voices, the sights and the sounds. Doesn't mean that they saw voices. You don't see voices. Rabbi Akiva says, oh, yes, you do. At Sinai, when the essence of the soul is being expressed and people are lifted out of the normal limitations of human parameters, God-given human parameters, Rabbi Akiva said, no, they saw what is normally heard and heard what is normally seen. They saw voices and heard visuals. We have no idea what that means. But what he's saying is, no, the Torah means that. And the Torah is telling us that there was something very, it's giving us an important information about the experience of how unworldly this was, how supernatural this was, is that they saw the voices and heard. Again, we don't know what that means, but what it means is that there was something very, very odd out here. So the Rebbe wants to analyze this, and I want to go into this a bit to talk about what these two debates between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva are, and in order to understand it, because it gives insight into what the Jewish people experienced there, and to some extent, to what is still the possibility at some level for those of us who are, as I mentioned at the beginning of this class, that we say our morning prayers, we thank God for the Torah. We say no teina Torah, that God gives the Torah. We say it in the present tense, that God is giving, not that God gave us the Torah. God gives us the Torah. When we study Torah, it's God giving it to us, and Talmud says that very clearly. That when we study Torah and we're in the right frame of mind, we are re-experiencing Sinai. And just as people stood at Sinai with this tremendous, overwhelming sense of inspiration, that's something we should and can experience. That's a Talmudic. I should have brought the Talmudic quote, but I did not. But it's there. Trust me. Okay. So why it's now? So in looking at this, the Rebbe says he asked a question about Rabbi Akiva. So why would you say Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva? So there was this miraculous experience we had at Sinai, where people are able to see sounds and hear visuals. So, and number 5, we have a Torah dictum, an axiom of Torah from one of the greats, Rabbi Nissim, from his book Drashat Aram, and he says God does not work unnecessary miracles. What would be the point? Splitting the sea saved the Jewish people. The miracles in Egypt, teaching a lesson. Who needs people to see sounds? It's like, what was the point for this psychedelic experience? There's nothing. What did God give them? Why? What's the meaning of it? So in order to look at this, I want to see what's the difference between hearing and seeing. They say seeing is believing. But in truth, and I've long thought this, seeing is not believing. Seeing is knowing. Believing is something you don't know. You have to have faith in it. Seeing, I'm looking at a can of seltzer right now. It's not that I believe there's a can of seltzer on my desk. It's right here. I see it. I know there's a can of seltzer on my desk. And Rashi himself, in the primary commentary Torah, in yesterday's Torah portion, also brings up and says there's a difference between because in the Torah yesterday, God says to the Jewish people, you have seen what God did at Sinai. He underscores that you saw this. For generations, this has to be embedded on the collective Jewish soul because it's something that you saw. What's seeing? Why does he underscore seeing? So Rashi tells us. There's a difference between what a person sees and what others tell him. With regard to what one hears, one is sometimes unsure as to whether one should believe it. If I hear and I believe something, and I've heard it from someone I trust, I can accept it. But there's some little, at least subconscious sticky note that I don't know. I don't know this first person. When I have seen and experienced something, that's in the tank. It is what it is. And this is an element that expresses itself in Jewish law. In the Talmud, there's the Talmud in the section we call it Rosh Hashanah, is the name of the tractate. Rosh Hashanah has quite a bit about the Jewish calendar and also has quite a bit about the process of determining months, because we have a lunar calendar, and so we have 12, or this year actually 13 months make up a year, but we don't have, it's not so much a halachic year. It's the year is, we have the seasons, and from there's 365 days for the cycle of seasons, that the Torah recognizes that, but the journey is based on months. And how do we know months? From the cycle of the moon. And how do we know the moon, when the moon passes between the sun and the earth and it's dark, that's the birth of a new moon. And that is 29 to 30 days of every month. That's the nature as God created it. In Torah law, there would be there was a mitzvah for many, many years until people, actually also under Roman times, they interfered with it. So we went to a calculated calendar where we determine when's Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of a month, and we have everything for years ahead, when's it's going to be Yom Kippur and all of that. In the olden days, and the way the Torah puts it is that every month, let's say today is the 21st day of the month on the Jewish calendar. So next week, sometime, people would start looking out as the 29th day arrives. We start looking out at night, say, do I see, or the 30th, see if there's a new moon, it goes dark, and when will we see a new moon? And they would have to come as witnesses to a court to see the new moon, that they saw the new moon. And the court would interrogate them, and then there was a system of flares on mountaintops throughout Israel, that everyone would know that today is the first day of the month, was declared the first day of the month. Once you know the first day of the month is, the Yom Kippur is the 10th, so we know 10 days from now and all of that. So everybody was able to know what the calendar is. And just parenthetically, that's why we have 2 days of holidays outside of Israel, because people couldn't find out for a while. So they knew it was either Rosh Chodesh was either this day or that day, because a month is either 29 or 30 days. And therefore, so we would count 2 days of Yom Tov. The first 2 days of Pesach, we have Passover as our next big holiday. we have 2 days of holiday and then 4 days of what we call intermediate days and then 2 days of holiday. In Israel, it's not that way. It's 1 day, 6 days, and 1 day. Why? Because they always have the Torah only says 1 day. Outside of Israel, we've had 2 days because of this inability to, in the old days, to transmit when Rosh Chodesh, beginning of the month, is. Now, I hope I didn't confuse anyone because that's that relevant. What's relevant is that there is a court system, and the court system is dependent on witnesses coming and testifying as to what they saw. Now, what happens if judges saw it? What happens if the judges saw it? So now who needs witnesses? The judges were outside. They're about to go in to sit. They look up and say, "Hey, there's the new moon." So the Torah says, Jewish law says that some of them can sit as justices, potentially, but other ones would have to act as witnesses. And in many cases, if not all cases, and a witness cannot be a judge. So let's look at this, what the Talmud says. It says, hearing about something is not as great as seeing it. What does that mean? When you see something, we're human beings. The physical is concrete, it's tangible. When you're seeing something tangible. You're seeing a moon, you're seeing a can of seltzer, you're seeing a car accident, you're seeing someone, God forbid, attack someone. You saw it. Hearing is a very important part of one of our senses. What we're doing is we are apprehending and we're collecting sounds which are they're important to us, but we're not seeing anything. It has less impact on us because we heard it, and maybe we misheard it. And it's not something that we have personally seen and experienced, the imprint on our psyche. And for that, it's the reason it says a witness cannot be a judge. Why? Because if, let's say, I'm a judge in a Jewish court, and I was at a ShopRite today, and I saw Mr. A in front of my eyes take a bat and whack Mr. B. I saw it. Now they come before the court. They say, I want damages. The guy attacked me. I'm not allowed to sit as a judge on such a case. Why? Because at least in cases of murder for sure, but cases of serious cases of damages, I need to be open to all sides. I need to hear possibilities. And if I saw something, I'm not open to any side. I know what I saw. No one's going to change my mind. And I brought from the Torah, it says the court will save the murderer. Why should a court save a murderer? The Torah wants, even in the case of murder, the Torah wants a court to be open to all sides. And therefore, in the court, there's a court that could judge capital cases was either 23 or 71. If all, let's say on the court of 23, of all 23 judges heard testimony, and they all voted unanimously for capital punishment, the Torah says don't give him capital punishment. Why not? So because it's impossible that 23 Jews and rabbis all agree that they could, not one of them could find the mitigating factor here. That means it seems so open and shut that the rabbis say that go back to the drawing board. There's no way someone's not going to find it. We know what happened, but why? Was he under distress? Did he mean, because motive is very big in Jewish law, and sanity is big in Jewish law, and that it was calculated is very big in Jewish law. Not just who took the knife to someone else. What went on? That you don't have anybody saying in this case it's manslaughter, not a homicide. We don't trust that. So it doesn't mean that we should let the person go. It means that we have to have an open mind to both sides and then process. But we have to have a proper analysis. When a person saw an event, if they can be a witness, they should be a witness. The Torah says it's a mitzvah to be a witness. But don't pretend you're open-minded to be a judge, because you know what you saw. And even if someone comes along and says the guy had a bad day or he's off his meds or whatever it is, it's hard to get away from what you saw. So the idea of hearing and seeing in Jewish law have a very stark difference between them. Seeing means for sure this exists. Hearing, if you're telling me, fine. Two people told me. Also, the more I hear, the more it makes sense to me, the more I accept that as a fact. But if someone comes along and makes a good case that my previous perception and the people who had told me otherwise, they were all basing themselves on a misperception, it's possible. Let me hear it. If I'm an open-minded person. So seeing doesn't grab us. Seeing isn't as tactile. I mean, hearing it doesn't grab us, or hearing is not as tactile as see. So therefore, now let's go back to Rabbi Akiva, who told us that at the Jews, the people saw what is usually heard and heard what is usually seen. It says, according to Rabbi Akiva, the Jews at Mount Sinai grasped godliness with the firmness and certitude usually associated with sight. Think about it. If you and I would get together, and this is a part of my life, we're sitting together on a Sunday morning in the library or on a Zoom, and we talk about whether there's God. You believe in God? Yeah. Is it a personal God, a God who cares? There is God, there isn't God. We have these conversations. That's what keeps me in business for 30 years. We have conversations. No one's going to debate whether that chair is here that you're sitting on. We're not going to spend time debating on whether or not this is a cranberry lime polar seltzer. It is what it is. We look at it. It's done. In our world, we see physicality. We see the human experience. That's not up for debate. We're not, come tell me it doesn't exist. I'm looking at it. I saw it. God, as much as we believe in it, we believe in God, God is at the end of the day is ultimately faith. It's hearing. We accept it, we studied it, it makes sense to us. But it's a hearing thing, and that's why we're going to consistently debate it, because at the end of the day, I can't show you God under a microscope. If I could show someone probably God, we wouldn't be having these conversations. It's a question of our mental process. And what Rabbi Akiva says is that at Sinai, God flipped the script. What he did is that the Jews at Mount Sinai grasped godliness with the firmness and certitude usually associated with sight. Sorry, I missed the with. Okay. And they processed what is usually seen, the physical reality, in a way of hearing. They understood that it exists. Since the Torah testifies in the beginning, God created. Let's get to the first one first. They looked at the world, and then they looked at the world and they saw, oh my gosh, this is God's world. Of course there's a mountain there. But the mountain is just a shell. The mountain is God's desire that there be a mountain. Of course there's a world around us, but it exists for a purpose. It's God's purpose is what's resonant. That the purpose is here is it's a mountain, there it's a bunny rabbit, there it's a person. It's different, but the fact is it's God's purpose is what's resonant. The example that might be, if we can imagine it, is imagine if I was looking, I was able to look, or someone's able to look at my hand through a microscope and see my DNA, see the deeper, just the physics, deeper layers of what's going on in my hand. First of all, again, my DNA structure, or whatever he can find, if he can find it there. But to be able to see. Now that is an entire world going on beneath my skin of my hand. The shell of it is my hand, as you see. It's not much to look at, but it's a hand. It's a skin covering 5 fingers on a palm and a hand, and it's there. If you could see beneath the surface, there's a huge world that really is what's behind what I see at the tip of the iceberg. What I see here is just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on underneath my skin. Now, if I was looking at it, of course, I know that there's a hand in the normal human sense, but that's not what I'm looking at right now. That's not what's taking up space in my mind. Yes, all these sinews and these blood vessels and all the action I see going on, yes, ultimately it leads to a hand that looks like this. But that's not the point. The point is I'm looking at what leads to the hand. I'm not just looking at the outer shell. So it's not that this no longer exists, it's just that's not what's taking up space. So the Jews at Sinai, because of the tremendous revelation of what they have, they're seeing the world through God's eyes. It's still a world. Their hand is still a hand. The sand is still sand. The mountain is a mountain. The goat is a goat. But they're seeing that all of this is God's creation. That there's a spiritual DNA coursing through everyone. That godliness is what's coursing through us, and God and divine purpose is what gives us existence. So when that becomes clear to them, when they have this spiritual microscope to see the supernatural, the metaphysical, and they can see it, that's the reality. That's what takes up space. Is there the outer shell of the world? Yeah, of course there is. Matter of fact, the Torah testifies to it. The Torah says, "Bereshit bara Elokim," the God created the world, so I know it. Yes, it's true. I'm living in God's world, and God says there's a world. But that's not what's taking up all the space. What's taking up all the space is what I'm seeing is I'm seeing it's the divinity that gives life its existence. And I brought in here, it's a little bit higher voltage, but to the extent we can, it can help us. I thought it might. This is from the Tanya, the founder of Chabad wrote Tanya, and the second section of the Tanya focuses on the idea of a oneness in the world. And focuses and the idea that God creates everything. All of us are like rays of the sun, the God's sun. And so to use that metaphor, if the sun is shining and there's a ray coming through the window, because I'm a person, I've been around for a while, I see a ray coming through the window, I know there's a sun out. For one of my young grandchildren, maybe they don't know. They see there's light, and maybe they're going to try and capture the light and take it home with them. I don't know. But they don't understand that it's dependent on the sun. But for me, I understand that the ray coming through the window is not an independent existence. And if a cloud passes between the sun and me, the ray's gone. Because it's just an expression of the sun. We are like rays of God's sun. We're created, we are important, we matter, but at the end of the day, we are as dependent on God, like a ray of the sun is dependent on the sun. And then, not only that, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman goes forward further and says the difference between the sun and the ray is that the sun is who knows how many miles away from me, and the ray it's not independent, but it's detached from the sun globe, sun planet. God is everywhere. So we are like a ray of the sun in the sun. And when you look up at the sun, if you could, once you're looking at the sun, you can't even distinguish one ray from another because it's all melted into the great sun. So a quote that he has from chapter 3 is, the reason that all things created and activated appear to us as existing and tangible, And we look at each other as being independent. We look at ourselves as being independent. I look at this can of seltzer as being independent. There's God, but then there's this can of seltzer. Is that we do not comprehend nor see with our physical eyes the power of God and the breath of his mouth, which is in the created thing. We say that God created the world through speech. That's the way the Torah says. God said this and God said that. And the idea, as the Torah lays it out, and Jewish spirituality lays it out, is that God's word is what consistently brings us into existence. God is still speaking, because our existence is not that we're created and then God goes somewhere. God is consistently creating us, and that's why we're existing. Just like the ray of the sun needs a consistent regeneration from the sun, or else it doesn't exist, which is in the created thing. If, however, the eye were permitted to see and to comprehend the divine life force and spirituality, which is in every created thing, then the materiality, grossness, and tangibility of the creature would not be seen by our eyes at all. For it is completely nullified in relation to the life force and the spirituality which is within it. And what this means is not that we would disappear if we saw the godliness within us. But like I said before, if I was able to see all of the subatomic action in my hand would still be my hand, it wouldn't disappear, but it would kind of melt into the background when I'm looking at the action of what's really going on beneath the surface. That's what will take up the space in my head, in my life, because that's everything. And the hand that I'm looking at is just the outer expression of all those dynamics. So having said that, what the Torah is saying is what Rabbi Akiva is saying, as the Rebbe puts it, is that the Jews at Sinai were brought to a place where they were able to see the internal dynamics, to see the godliness of which is in reality, which gives reality its reality, and therefore they saw what is usually heard. The godliness was not something they could debate. The godliness was something that you sit and you look at a real world, and in those days, whatever, a tent and a sheep and a mountain and a tree, and then say, oh, there's God too. No, there's God, and God created these things. Now, having said that, now let's go back to the fact that there's a debate. That was what Rabbi Akiva said. Rabbi Akiva is saying, remember, there were two debates. One was that between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel said that that there was that the Jews said on the positives yes and the negatives no. Rabbi Akiva said on the positives yes and on the negatives no. Yes. And then Rabbi Shmuel said when it came to the sounds and sights, even though the Torah says the Jews saw the sounds, he says no. They saw sights, but they all saw it, and they saw what's seen, and they heard what's heard. There was nothing funky going on. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, there was something very funky going on. They saw what's usually heard. Okay. Now, we saw what Rabbi Akiva is saying, because that the idea of seeing what is usually heard means perceiving in a concrete way what is usually something just a matter of faith. But now let's frame this. What is Rabbi Shmuel? How does this tell us the two opinions here and perspectives? So what I brought here is from number 12, and this is a kind of a critical way of that will come up. It comes up a lot in spiritual thought about what happened at Sinai. And we're almost certainly going to revisit this as we go on through the year. The Medrash tells us an analogy of an emperor who controls Rome and Syria, who decrees Romans can't ascend to Syria and Syrians can't ascend to Rome. Says, right? And the Caesars, what are Caesars? There's Rome, there's Syria. twain shall not meet. What's the analogy? The Medrash tells us, likewise, when God created the world, and he created spirituality and the physical, he decreed the heavens are God's, and the earth he gave to humanity. There was human beings were given the physical condition, and then there's the spiritual, and there's a separation. So there's only so much that Abraham and Sarah could tap into in the spiritual because they're human. That's normal. Torah, when we got to Torah, God abolished that the distinction. And this is, we could talk an hour about this, but let's just, I want to try and keep it focused. At Mount Sinai, he nullified his decree. The lower realm shall ascend to the higher shall ascend to the lower, and I will be first. As is written, God descended upon Mount Sinai. Godliness was part of the physical world. So it said, it says the spiritual will come down and the physical will go up. There is the blending. So again, this is just an aside, and I maybe I shouldn't have too many detours. If you think about it, that we, as Jews, as Judaism, will say that if I have a tuna sandwich this afternoon, and I say, thank you, God, for this tuna sandwich, I make a bracha and I eat it because I want to have strength to be who God wants me to be, that's holy. In other spiritual streams that I know of, that's crazy. Holiness is meditation, it's singing, it's whatever it is. Tuna sandwich is a tuna sandwich. And God says, Torah Judaism says, no. The physical acts can be as holy as spiritual acts. It's not just the domain of the spiritual. You can be living as holy a life in your office tomorrow as you are on Saturday morning in a shul. Saturday shul is a place that's dedicated to holiness. Your office is not, but you have a mezuzah, and you're also doing things the way God wants you to, and you're in a moral way, and you're helping society, and you're supporting your family. What's not holy about that? So the Torah is saying that it's all God's. God created the spiritual, God created the physical, and there was a separation. And at Sinai, God said, now I'm going to show you how to lead a holy life, not only in a temple, in a holy temple or in a shul, or not only in meditation or when you're praying. Those are all important facets. But what about when you're eating lunch or when you're dealing with a client or with your supervisor? Also holy. There's a way to live that way. So there's this difference. Now, that was kind of an aside. The idea, as the Medrash puts it, is that there's the holiness, spirituality coming down. It says, right, the lower realms shall descend to the higher shall descend to the lower. So what does that mean? The human is the lower realms, the spiritual is the higher realms. So the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law, put it this way, in that this, you can understand it through two different ways of looking at life. The difference between the path of the perfectly righteous and that of the penitent are that there are two general methods to connecting the world with godliness. The straightforward, what he calls in Kabbalah language, the straightforward beam of light. God is beaming holiness to our world. And then there's reflected light. Reflected light is what you and I do when we wake up in the morning. We say, something, I want to do something good. I'm going to do a mitzvah. Or I'm going to pray. Or I'm going to, whatever it is. That's light generated from below, called reflected light. The straightforward light is light which beams from above into the physical world. Reflected light is the idea of the recipient making itself into, in other words, herself, into a vessel for the divine. So us lifting ourselves towards God, making ourselves proper conduits for holiness, getting away from some of the limitations and crassness that can be part of living a human life and trying to find more godliness, that is like the lower realms lifting up. And us sitting in prayer and God sharing inspiration and a feeling of holiness with us is God bringing, even if we don't feel it, but bringing a holiness to our lives. Now, Rabbi Shmuel I should have done this a little bit. Let's skip 14. I'm going to come back to it. The order should have been a little different. Look at 15. 15 is about a Kohen. The Kohen is someone who's a functionary of God's, and by Torah thinking that the Kohen their point was to be a conduit for bringing godliness to the world. There is a practice for thousands of years until today, outside of Israel, it's only on holidays, a practice called the priestly blessing, Birchat Kohen. The priestly blessing is during a service, the Musaf service on a holiday, and the priests will stand in front, the Kohen will stand in front of the congregation and give a blessing. With all due respect to a Kohen, and I'm not a Kohen, I can't be a Kohen, and I love Kohenim, and I'm glad that we have them. We're not so much looking for the Kohen's blessing. Everybody's blessing is worth something. But the way the Torah describes it is they are a conduit for God's blessing. It's not the Kohen's blessing. It's God's blessing through the Kohen, through the human condition. There are certain there's a certain group of people where God said their souls are designed to be a conduit for my blessing for everyone else. It's a beautiful thing. We give them a lot of respect for that. But the fact is that they are as a conduit. Rabbi Shmuel was a Kohen, as I said before. And Leviticus says a Kohen should be holy to God. His job was to bring holiness to the world. So if we spoke about these two rhythms, from above to below and below to above, from God sending holiness into the world and us lifting ourselves out of the natural self-orientation that we have as human beings, that God created that way, and making ourselves, aligning ourselves more with higher ideas and with God and godly blessing, godliness, so that one is from below rising and from above coming down. Rabbi Shmuel's position was he was a perfectly righteous person, a holy Kohen, Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who was bringing holiness to the world. Rabbi Akiva was coming from a totally different direction. The Talmud tells us that Rabbi Akiva began studying Torah at age 40. The Talmud tells us more. He did not like Torah scholars. Maybe he had feelings of inadequacy. He was very very opposed. Oh, someone just asked me a question, or maybe not just. Okay. He was opposed to the rabbis, and he was inspired at age 40, even though he had given up on himself, to start studying. He was illiterate, and to start studying, he became the rabbi, the teacher of our entire nation, the greatest teacher of our entire nation. He is an example throughout history of someone who can literally raise themselves up. And he's a person who felt that way. So Rabbi Akiva is someone who was moving upwards. Rabbi Shmuel the idea was he was trying to bring God down. Now, in that sense, you could say, it says that when Rabbi Akiva, just to show you who Rabbi Akiva was, in 17, it says when they took Rabbi Akiva to his execution, 2nd century, the Talmud tells us that when Hadrian took him to his execution, it was time to recite the Shema. The Shema is the proclamation of oneness of God. And it's we're told the Romans used iron combs to tear his flesh. It was a slow, tortured death. Yet Rabbi Akiva was accepting upon himself the yoke of God. Yet Rabbi Akiva is saying Shema. Saying he is expressing his faith in the oneness of God as they are torturing him to death. His students, who were no spiritual slouches, they exclaimed to him, "A rabbi, to such an extent, you're dying, and you're busy with Shema, and you're talking about God's oneness in the world." Now, in the Shema, and I should put this here, right after the initial Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, the oneness of God, the verse after that says we should love God with all our heart, with our soul, and with all our might. Give ourselves over to God. So when they asked this to Rabbi Akiva, he responded, "All my days I was troubled by the phrase in the Shema, with all your soul." How do I serve God with all my soul? I'm not giving him my soul, I'm alive. Meaning, and the Talmud says it means even if God takes your soul, you should still be committed to God. In other words, even to death. But I'm not dying, I'm alive. So what do you mean? How honest am I being when I say I love God, even to the extent of taking my life? When I know he's not taking my life, I'm here. I said to myself all my years, when will I have the opportunity to fulfill this concept? When will I ever see whether I'm really willing to give myself over to God, even to the extent of my life? Now that I have the opportunity, should I not be fulfilling it? So Rabbi Akiva was someone who represents rising somehow in an incredible way. He represents living in the limitations of the human condition. He grew up ignorant. He grew up poor. He did not come from a noble family. Did not come from an observant family. He's experiencing the horror of what man's humanity, the worst of our limited reality. And he's rising above it. He's surging beyond it. He's transcending the limitations. Rabbi Shmuel is about bringing God down to earth. Rabbi Akiva is about earth transcending its limitations to meet God. So, in that sense, Rabbi Akiva makes sense. So he says, at Sinai, the whole point was that they saw what is usually heard. They got past their limitations. That's what it's all about. The human limitations, they are limits. They stifle us. And the beauty of Sinai is that you could see what's usually heard and hear what is usually seen. It's experiencing something beyond the human. Rabbi Shmuel said that's not the point of life. The point of life is feeling God. When you see what is seen and when you hear what's heard. I'm bringing God down to the human condition. Stop dismantling it. It's about God being felt as we exist as humans. And that's why I brought 14. According to Rabbi Shmuel, is saying it was people saw what is usually seen, heard what is usually heard, and yet people saw and trembled, so they stood from afar. They were overwhelmed by the inspiration. They were trembling as humans who see and hear like you and I see and hear. Rabbi Akiva was saying, yes, you and I see and hear, and we have to respect that, but this is a very special event. A special event that lifted us above our limitations. And we should always be trying to lift ourselves above our limitations. We're not going to be able to see what's usually heard. However, we will be able to see in our mind's eye things that aren't so apparent to us. We'll be able to taste a certainty in our love, a love of a loved one, in our faith, that there's a certain, even if you can't see it under a microscope, it's okay. That we should be able to be open to a certitude of spirituality too. Now, how does that translate into the first debate? They said, yes on positive commandments and no on negatives, or yes and positives and yes on negatives. Take a look at our regular the formula that we have for all mitzvahs. We say Asher Kiddishanu Mitzvot V'Tzivanu, and then that means thank you, God, who has sanctified us with His commandments and directed us to light Shabbos candles, put up a mezuzah. It's you fill in the blanks at the end of that formula. I think we're probably all familiar with that. So there's two things. We're thanking God that there's such a thing as mitzvahs. Thank you, God, for the relationship. You gave us commandments as a way of a bond with you. We're thanking you that there's such a thing as mitzvahs. We're thanking you there's such a thing as a relationship. And then we're saying, and He told us to do this specific one. This specific one is but it's beyond. It's not just about the specifics. It's about the relationship. And then He asked me to do this. So we reflect both of those in our blessing. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva looked at it from two different perspectives, like I said before. Rabbi Akiva, he said, when you love someone, the fact that they ask you to do something is the treasure. What it is a distant second. You're doing something. They ask you to bring a kugel, you bring a kugel. They ask you not to make noise, they ask you not to make noise. That's not relevant. It's that you have a chance to do something for a loved one. So therefore he said, when God said, do this, they said, sure, yes. And then when they said, don't do this, they said, yes. Because it's all about the yes. It's all about that we're able to do something special for you. Not getting into the details. The details will come soon. Rabbi Shmuel said, no, it's all about the details. It's about bringing God into the minutiae of our life. I'll do this, and I won't do that because it's exactly what you asked me to. The focus was very different. And Rabbi Akiva's yes, in that sense, Rabbi Akiva's yes on positive commandments was not the same yes as Rabbi Shmuel's. Rabbi Shmuel's thing was, you asked me to put up a mezuzah, yes. Rabbi Akiva's was, yes, you're giving me mitzvahs, yes. And now I have the honor of being able to put up a mezuzah. That happens to be the mitzvah. And one final insight into this, because since we're talking about with Rabbi Akiva and the Rebbe brought this, it's a pretty famous story in the Talmud, the end of the tractate Makos. It says Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Akiva, after the destruction of the temple, they approached the desolate side of the temple. They saw a fox emerging, and they began weeping, while Rabbi Akiva was laughing. So they're crying. They see the destroyed temple. Rabbi Akiva is laughing. They say, what's up with you? How can you laugh? This is terrible. Look what we're seeing here. They said, then why are you laughing? He replied, in the prophecy of Uriah, it says, Zion shall be plowed as a field. We were told by God that because of everything going on, yes, there will be a destruction. Zion, the temple will be plowed like a field. But there's another prophecy of Zechariah that says that in the future, there shall yet be elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem rejoicing. This is from one of the forecast, the prophecy of Mashiach. So now, Rabbi Akiva says, 1 second. It's one God, right? We trust prophecy, we don't trust prophecy. Now that we see the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, there is a destruction. That's fulfilled, the other one's going to be fulfilled. We can look forward to the prophecy of Zechariah being fulfilled. Why are you only taking half prophecies? It's God. And God said, this is going to happen, and it happened. This is going to happen. The sages said to him, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. The idea, as the Rabbi put it, is that Rabbi Akiva had the ability to see the yes, to see the godliness in the world, even when it clearly was not being seen. The Romans are ripping him apart. The temple is destroyed. And he knew that God was with them. And this is the idea of being able to reach a level of connection and relationship where even when there's something that in front of our eyes doesn't seem to support the relationship, doesn't seem to support our feeling of, oh my gosh, there's a loving God and God cares about me. Because in our mind's eye, the faith is something we can't see under a microscope, but we know it's true. Like we know that a loved one's love is real, and even more so. Rabbi Kiva teaches us that as much as we are indeed only going to see what is seen and hear what is heard, and it's about bringing holiness to a very defined world, and we can't ignore the parameters of our reality. Part of us always, and during prayer, hopefully, or others always wants to transcend and say, but I know you're beyond all this. And I want to connect with you, God, beyond all this, and bring that God, the God I know who is beyond what I'm seeing here, and bring that into my life and feel it more, feel close. And with that, it's so much easier to ride the waves, so to speak. So if there are any questions, to those, if not.
Yes.
Yes.
I found one thing especially disturbing in today's presentation, and that is the line about witnesses cannot be judges.
Yeah.
And the reason I find that disturbing is in the context of the January 6th hearing and all of the things that go with it. How can we, because everybody in the country witnessed what happened on January 6th, how can we act as judges?
I'm not sure what you're saying. I think that a judge, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to make judgments for yourself, but for a judge needs to be someone who is assessed to be able to be open-minded. And even a judge, I would imagine that even a judge would understand that what you see on a video, they have to be open and say, maybe there's something they didn't see on a video. There's something that was beyond. And I think that we've all experienced, and I'm not talking about January 6th, I mean, it was what it was, but that we've all seen that sometimes a video is presented and it's been in the media, and there's people will say, oh my gosh, that's what happened. And then you see the rest of the video, it's not so simple.
Exactly.
So I'm not saying that about January 6th. I'm saying just in general. So if there's a judge who saw certain video clips and is certain about what happened, I think he probably shouldn't be. He or she probably shouldn't be.
Right.
But the same people who were threatened by the actions of the mob are now sitting collecting information for the courts.
Okay, I'm not. This is kind of it's a little bit of a toxic topic, but I would say that all of us and everybody, especially anyone in elected office, and certainly anyone on the bench, should ask themselves 3, 5, 6, 7 times, am I being objective? Am I open to all the data? And if they can't answer that with a resounding yes, they should play golf that day and let someone else sit with this. Yes.
Rabbi, I have a question. You know what I find pretty amazing? Here it is, you're teaching us Torah. And one of the undermining issues that even goes back to Moses and at the most sacred site, Mount Sinai, is still this question of belief. You know, when you're a religious person, you say you've made the leap of faith. You know, you've accepted it. Yet we spend so much of our time in shul, we're supposed to feel relaxed and maybe having reached that point. But we go over Torah selections constantly about this belief and whether we should believe because, you know, God predicted it. Moses's questions of God all the time. It's like the dichotomy that kind of makes you feel while you're sitting in shul, why are you actually there? You know, often, sometimes when you raise the question, it's not so much the intellectual understanding of why you're asking it, but it does leave the impression that even while you're praying, there's still that question.
I'm not sure if there's a question in what you're asking. I think it's a comment about our experience, and I can relate to that. And I think that we have different parts of our personality, and when we're in shul, as you said, or in synagogue, or in a spiritual place, in a place of prayer, sitting in that place of prayer in and of itself is not necessarily going to do anything. It's not necessarily going to give you any lift, a spiritual lift. We need to be able to guide ourselves to a connected place, connected with God, connected with our best selves, and we're not shutting off the part of our brain that says, but why, or how do you know, or whatever. But right now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to focus and plug in to the relationship, and plug into what we're being told and what we accept, what being told, knows what's passed on for 3,300 years from my great-grandparents and your great-grandparents, that there's a God who loves us and cares us and is embracing us, and then to open ourselves up to that embrace. Now, someone could say, but you're not seeing the embrace, and how do you know that? All those questions I can hang on a little hook for now. But right now, is a time for me to experience the closeness, if we can. It's not a simple thing. The Zohar, Kabbalah calls prayer a time of war. It's internal war. And to be able to keep the focus, and to be able to really be plugged in, as the best way for me to put it, is not as simple as it sounds.
Rabbi?
Yes, ma'am.
A quick question. I'm sorry to be a nudge about this, but could you talk to whoever does your website and see whether the recordings could be linked on the website somewhere?
Okay, so we were working on that last week, and I don't know. I know that somebody, I really asked last week. I don't know if we got it. I just kind of I should have checked. If
That's okay. I jumped on.
I'm gonna check now. See what's.
I jumped on the website and I saw where it lists like the Sunday discussions, and I thought, well, that would be a great place to list to link the recordings. Didn't see anything, but it would be so great to be able to go back and even if they started from now moving forward, like forget about the archive that you already have. But
Jerry, you're 100% right, and we definitely should get that done. Some of it may be done. Some things were definitely done. I know they were accomplished. I don't know if we actually posted it. I will check. I thank you for bringing it up, and I'm going to check.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
I have a weird question.
Oh, good. Sounds good.
I don't know how the thoughts get put together, but do you think that when we die and and God reclaims our soul, we have in that transcendence, that aha moment where we see almost what the people saw at Sinai, where it becomes very clear to us in our soul?
Very much. Very much.
God did all this?
Very much. It's all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this is.
So it really happens when.
Yeah. Yes, okay. There's a clarity. We see it from yes.
So we can actually possibly carry that with us into another life.
Yeah, absolutely. And we say that that's at the time of when we talk about Mashiach also. All of a sudden, it's like, oh my gosh, there's a scriptural story of Joseph and his brothers. They sold him into slavery, and he becomes viceroy of Egypt, and they come to him, and they think he's just the viceroy of Egypt. He knows who they are. They're seeing two totally different realities. He knows exactly what's going on. They're in the dark. And as soon as he said, I am Joseph, all of a sudden, it's a paradigm shift. Oh my gosh, that's how he knew who who's oldest. That's now everything makes sense. Now they get all the things that they've been sweating over these months. Now they understand it. And one of the great rabbis says that type of, oh my gosh, now I get it. That's what we look forward to, like when Mashiach comes and the soul leaves. Oh, now it's all making sense.
I just thought it was weird, but
Yeah,
I guess not. Okay.
All right. Be well, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you,
too.
Rabbi.
Rabbi.